Good afternoon and welcome. We have a wonderful episode for you today during our Deep Roots Native Plant webinar. Before we begin with our virtual hike to Nelson Island with Johnson County Parks and Recreation District, I just have a couple of notes for you all. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Johnson County Park and Recreation District, for connecting people to nature in their backyards and beyond. Also, a special thanks to donors like you for making these types of programs possible. If you are a natural resource professional or native plant enthusiast, join us for our annual Planet Native Landscapes Conference in Kansas City this February. From the 11th through 12th, we will have several different presentations by renowned experts from across the country, all focusing on native plants, habitat, and how we can better support a biodiverse earth and community. I will be sure to include links to this and other resources discussed in today's show following today's webinar. And if you like what you see today, consider joining me for a hike at Nelson Island on Saturday, November 16th. I'll be joined with two natural resource technicians from Johnson County Parks and Recreation District. So we can all take a fun guided naturalist walk together during my favorite season, fall. This is a very cool place, as you'll see in today's program, and I would love to share it with you in person. So again, I'll be sure to include links to this program following today's webinar so you can sign up. And as always, this webinar will be recorded and the resources will be available online. I'll also send you an email directly following today's show with all the links discussed today, including the species shown and discussed in today's webinar. Don't forget, put your comments in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A. After today's webinar, or at least towards the end of it, Matt Garrett, our Natural Resource Manager from Johnson County Parks and Recreation District, will be there to answer your questions live. So be sure to fill up that Q&A for us. After today's show, please visit us online at deeproots.org for more information on upcoming events, webinars, native gardening resources, and more. While you're there, consider making a donation. All right, now I'd like to welcome to the virtual stage Matt Garrett, our guest expert for today's webinar. He is the Natural Resource Manager for Gold Medal Award-winning Johnson County Parks and Recreation District. He's dedicated his entire career to environmental education and natural resource management in the Kansas City area. He is a regional conservation leader focused on large-scale prairie restoration, invasive plant removal, and conservation planning. In his spare time, he mountain bikes, throws frisbees to his blue heeler, and likes to spin records. Matt, it's so great to have you back on our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Excited.
Yeah, this is a great episode, and I had so much fun hiking with you and Madigan Morrison, the natural resource tech with you. And so we've got a great show for everyone today. So folks, remember, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A during today's program. And at the end, or in the middle of the Q&A, we will have a pop quiz, and you might be the lucky one to win this native plant card set by local artist Nancy Waugh. 'Tis the season to be writing cards, isn't it? So go ahead and stick around for our Q&A at the end. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I hope you will all enjoy today's Deep Roots Native Plant webinar, Nelson Island with Johnson County Parks and Recreation District.
Hello, my name is Madigan Morrison. I am a natural resource technician with Johnson County Parks and Recreation District.
I'm Matt Garrett, Natural Resource Manager for the Johnson County Park and Recreation District. And today we're here at the wilder access of Nelson Island, and we are part of the Mill Creek Trail system. And this is going to be a 17-mile long trail that goes from the Kansas River near 435 all the way into Olathe. And so it's kind of the hub of a streamway greenway corridor through the heart of Johnson County. So the Mill Creek Streamway Trail has one of the oldest bluebird trails in Johnson County. And in the entire county park system this year, we just got the numbers yesterday, but we fledged over 1,800 baby bluebirds.
That's so many baby birds.
Yeah, so we have huge volunteer team, and they are all along all these trails. And we have interpretive kiosks like what we have here today explaining their importance. And it's been a phenomenal program, and it's had a huge amount of growth. We have a team of master naturalists that have a nest box program, and they go out and weekly monitor the bluebird houses through the entire county. Some parks have over 100 bluebird houses, and I think altogether we might have like 600 of them out there. And so we had really great nest success this year. It's a full season of care.
Yeah.
And so they're going to take the bluebird house at the end of the season, clean it out, button it up for the winter time, and then we had eggs in March this year. And so we could have a nest by early March, eggs by the end of March, and then we had eggs and fledglings all the way through the end of September into October this year. And so they check for black rat snakes, they check for ants and wasps and things like that, and they check on the eggs, see how many eggs, and then how many hatch, and then how many fledge.
So how can folks support animals like our bluebirds in their own spaces?
Yeah, so having native plants in your backyard, native berries available for the bluebirds, having lots of artificial housing is what we've used. And so that's having a bluebird box possibly in your yard that would be available for them. And don't be discouraged if it takes a couple years. Sometimes it takes us 2 to 3 seasons before a box gets a permanent resident. So Mill Creek is a very urban watershed. And where we're standing during a storm event or a large flood event could be completely underwater. And so where we parked our car could be under 8 feet of water. And whenever the Kansas River is high, that slows down Mill Creek and it actually backs Mill Creek up. And so we'll get into a situation where it'll back up all the way up towards Shawnee Mission sometimes. So it's very flashy. The water comes up quickly and it goes down quickly. But it's really important for wildlife. So this creek corridor on the lower end, as it gets closer to the Kansas River, has really unique invertebrates. It's got more fish diversity than you would expect. It had some of the more diverse stream fish that you would see in eastern Kansas, which kind of shocked some of the fisheries biologists. And it's really important for wood ducks, mallards, a lot of your common, what you would expect to see in a corridor, kingfishers, things like that. So this lower end of Mill Creek is navigable, but once you get up a little further, like another quarter to a half mile, it gets a lot harder to navigate it on a kayak or a canoe. Nelson Island and the trailhead we just left is kind of in between a landfill, an interstate, a sand barge operation, a wastewater treatment plant, and I think 3 different railroad tracks coming together. And so it's really important critical habitat that is in a very industrial zone, and it's been that way probably since the 50s. When we get to Nelson Island, we'll go out to where Cleggie Nelson was a hermit and had possibly been brewing some illegal things during Prohibition. All right, so we are now at a small prairie restoration right before the entrance to Nelson Island. And the power of Mill Creek has eroded, I believe, over a half acre of this prairie. And so the force of these urban storm events has basically removed at least a half acre to 3/4 of an acre. We had a paved trail where we're standing right now and it's gone. Sorry, we're in a high wind event. And so we lost a whole paved trail network and we had to shift it to the other side of this prairie. And we also just recently purchased land we're really excited about, we'll talk about later in this episode, to give us a little bit more space to stay away from these erosion events. So as Olathe has been built out and the southern end of the watershed, the storm events here are a lot more aggressive. And so every storm event, the water comes faster and it begins to just erode more and more of this corridor. So then all the native plant roots in the world can't stop storms like this. So what we can do in a lot of these situations is our agency is beginning to move away from like heavy limestone riprap rocking of slopes, and we're going to start moving towards doing like a green remediation where there may be some limestone at the toe, but then we do willow stakes and native plantings and cut the bank back and try to do a lot less aggressive armament of a slope. And when we come back to fix something like this, we're going to use a lot more soft native materials to do that work, and that's where the industry is going. But doing this kind of work and fixing these eroding stream banks is incredibly expensive, millions and millions of dollars. All right, so what's working against us here is we have a very sandy river bottom soil on the banks of the Kansas River. And so when these storm events come through, this soil just melts like sugar, and the prairie roots do their best to hold this prairie in place. But the urban watershed and these really erodible soils just have made a perfect combination of making it a really hard place to hold on to long term. And we know in a big river ecosystem that these edges are moving. And the power of the Kansas River and the power of Mill Creek coming together here has created a situation where every time you visit this spot, it might be a little bit different.
Okay, so we're in the prairie along the banks of Mill Creek. And what we're seeing here is a lot of grass-heavy areas, which is indicative of the fire history that we have seen. So for many years, the seasonality of the fires here was in about April, which encourages grass growth and discourages the forbs, the flowers that we usually see in a prairie alongside of it. So that's how you can see the history coming up in the plant assemblage here. And in the future, we're planning to seed with more forbs in this area, and we will continue with fire at different times of year to try and diversify the plant assemblage. So the major grasses you see here are kind of the classic heavy hitters of the tallgrass prairie. This one in your hand, this is Sorghastrum nutans, golden feather grass. And then right below it, a little shorter, this is little blue stem, Schizochirium scoparium. And I bet we'll see some big blue stem in here as well. Those are the most common that I've been seeing as we're walking through today.
Oh, kingfishers.
So this is evidently a great spot for birding.
Yeah, so on eBirds, it has a couple hundred species. It's really awesome warbler habitat. So if you are a birder in the springtime, Nelson Island is every warbler that will be moving through eastern Kansas you'll find in these trees down here. So where we're standing now is kind of a scary spot if you're a resource manager, and we send teams out in all-terrain vehicles. And right here, we have a beautiful tall grass prairie, and what you can't see is the grass has covered the collapse of the bank. And so when we're out on a fire or we're managing invasive species, and you're on the prairie side, you can't see this drop off. And so it's really critical when you're out doing habitat work that you have a seatbelt on, you're in your roll cage, and you are aware. And if you are uncomfortable or you know you're getting close to an edge, you really should stop the vehicle, take a look around, and make sure you're in a safe place to continue operating. Because a lot of times people doing natural resource work die every year in rollover accidents where they don't have their seatbelts on, or they come across a ditch or something they're not aware of. And so we really make sure our team understand, and we all know where they went for the day, and that they're operating safely, and that we're watching out for hazards like this where your machine could roll all the way down into Mill Creek. And it is cool because this place is so beautiful and it's surrounded by industrial development, but right now you wouldn't know that. We're listening to kingfishers, we're hearing wind in the prairie, and you're in just a beautiful natural area at this point. All right, so we're actually going to go on to Nelson Island now, and we're going to use this bridge to cross over onto the island. And a flood in the late 90s took this entire bridge. And so when we're talking about the force of the Kansas River, I believe it was in 1998, there was a flood event that took this giant bridge and put it out in the Kansas River. And so we're talking about massive forces down here. And so when we get to Nelson Island, we're going to cross over and we're going to actually experience that kind of riparian habitat.
So what we're seeing here is called a riparian area, which is an area defined by the type of disturbance we've been talking about, regular flooding and flash water events. So the plants that you see here are adapted to that. They like their roots wet. They can withstand that kind of disturbance. And what we are most familiar with that we'll see is cottonwood, which is the state tree of Kansas. We'll also see sycamores down here most likely, and silver maples are very common as well. We're at the very edge of river birch habitat as well. We're on the western edge of that, but that is also a common riparian tree. These are really important to this ecosystem because, like we've talked about, the river will scour away the edges where it is like forcing the soil to fall, and the roots of these trees are erosion control. With exceptions as well of like the shrubs and grasses do that as well, but the trees really are like the star of the show when we're talking about that.
Yeah, so we've got a beautiful hackberry tree, and it's something in our river corridors that get pretty large. You don't think of hackberry trees as being enormous, but one of the state champion hackberries was on Mill Creek a little further south from here. His name was Old Leroy, and it was the largest hackberry I've seen in my lifetime, and it eventually succumbed to old age. But they can be massive in this corridor. We were at a conference in Manhattan a couple weeks ago with folks from the northern U.S., and they'd never seen hackberries this big. And they were just shocked as they were walking around eastern Kansas to see hackberries that were of any size whatsoever. So it's fun to, when people from a different region come and see trees that are pretty common to us, and they're shocked at the size of them, you know, in an area that you take them for granted. So we do a lot of great invasive management in Johnson County, but it's not all rosy. So we have almost 9,000 acres of public land, and we've removed almost 1,000 acres of bush honeysuckle in the county, but we haven't been everywhere. And Nelson Island is one of those pivotal places that we have not been to yet. And we have not fully brought like the resources between our staff, volunteers, and conservation contractors here. But it's one of our next steps in our resource plan. And so right now we're redoing our resource plan and focusing on really key conservation areas. And so the improvement and expansion of habitat in Nelson Island is really important to us. And so unfortunately, we see a euonymus or winter creeper, which is on the forest floor, woodland floor here, and it's beginning to go aerial and begun to climb the trees. And that's how it reproduces. And it's a really, really difficult plant to remove from an ecosystem. It has a really waxy leaflet, and we'll have to, in September, come in here and use an herbicide. And it can take 2 seasons, 2 years or more, to get full control of winter creeper. And then everything else we see is bush honeysuckle in this understory. And so what's really going to be important for us, getting the bush honeysuckle out, getting a bunch of native grasses and wildflowers in here, probably planting young pawpaw trees, young hackberries, young cottonwoods and sycamores, and we're going to have to bring back a new healthy understory to this riparian woodland.
So winter creeper, right? And I just want to show this specific example because it has started going vertical. Typically you see it will go, when it goes vertical, it'll form seed, but it usually climbs trees to achieve that, and this is growing on itself and producing seed, which is pretty scary, right? So it doesn't even have to be very tall in order to do this. And I've seen this with cultivars as well as this species here. And so it's just I just want to show you all the importance of removing winter creeper before it gets mature like this. Because even if it's not climbing a tree, that doesn't necessarily mean it cannot produce seed. Because it's able to climb on itself and get enough height to start producing. And birds will take these seeds and spread them elsewhere, and then you just have a huge workload ahead of you in removing these species. And not to mention, when they do climb your trees, they will strangle them and kill your trees. So if you have it climbing on your trees, we've got some really good resources on how to remove it, which I will include in the show notes.
We had volunteers down here and staff start a project, and we started removing honeysuckle here. And then we realized we were doing too many things at once, so we backed off. And I can unfortunately see areas where the honeysuckle is as big as when we cut it down the first time. So we're not going to re-engage this project until we have the resources to officially remove it all and maintain it for at least a decade. And so we learned early on that anybody can remove bush honeysuckle, but it takes decades to control it. And so we paused, and once we have the resources available, we're going to come back here and manage it correctly and restore the entire area.
What we're seeing in this area is a colony of pawpaw trees. This is one of our really popular native fruits. So the tree is kind of a relic of tropical ecosystems here that has held on. The fruits that come off of it, people describe as a cross between a mango and a banana. And we're a little beyond pawpaw season, but it's usually early fall that we'll see those ripening. And they're really pretty right now. They always turn this like really pale yellow green that I love so much. And they form these really kind of dense colonies like you see here. So if you even look at the leaves, you can see how it's almost like a tropical look, the way the leaves are so broad.
We do have a native Lepidoptera that hosts on the pawpaws. It is our zebra swallowtail butterfly. And this is a beautiful kind of pale white butterfly with black stripes, smaller than your tiger swallowtails. And you'll see them in springtime as they are flying around searching for their host plant, right? So they will lay their eggs on this tree, the babies will eat the leaves, and they will continue their cycle. And so not only are, as Madigan mentioned, pawpaws are really fun to find and enjoy for us, but the leaves itself are crucial for our wildlife too. So that's pretty neat.
And there's a toxin in the pawpaw
Say more.
that the caterpillar consumes, and it protects the caterpillar.
Really?
Yeah.
That's very cool. Nature's so cool.
Yeah.
I love that insects can do that.
Yeah.
In the spring when the pawpaws flower, you get this very unexpected flower out of them, which is a downward facing cup, dark purple singular flower along the stem. And they smell rancid because they are pollinated by flies, not the butterflies that we like so commonly think of as pollinators. So it's just this really interesting ecology that shines light on these other types of pollinators that we don't discuss very often. I've heard of people when they want to attract pollinators to their pawpaw groves, when they farm them intentionally, they will hang raw meat to attract those flies to the area, which is pretty intense and quite a decision. You can fit like your whole hand in these fissures of the cottonwood. These are a very fast growing tree. Yeah, these have been documented to grow up to 3 to 5 meters per year when they're young, which is extraordinarily fast.
Look at that.
So you'll see these humongous trees, and they're surprisingly young for how large they are.
Wow.
In these systems, you get a lot of movement of the river naturally. The river likes to move around. It will deposit sediment. It will have flooding events where it will just like clean slate a whole area. And that is where cottonwoods like to germinate. The seeds fall onto new sediment in very high sunlight spots. And that is when you get the early succession of a new riparian area. So yeah, when we're talking riparian areas, it is that. It is a constant reversal and reset and a constant movement from early to late succession.
We are on the actual banks of the Kaw Kansas River right now, and it is the largest prairie river in the world. And so it drains from an almost 100% originally prairie ecosystem from this whole region. And bald eagles are everywhere down here in the wintertime. And so we have an interpretive sign, and we have a large expanse so you can see how big their wings are. But if you want to see a bald eagle in Kansas City, parking at our access point for Nelson Island, down at, it's called the Wilder Access, and hiking out here to this point, and you find the eagle interpretive sign, and then you look out on the Kansas River, and you're gonna, if you pick the right time of year, you're gonna see bald eagles everywhere, fishing in this backed up slow part of the Kansas River. So when you're gonna come down here in January and February, you're going to find a lot of eagles on this whole Kansas River corridor from the 435 bridge up to Nelson Island. And as beautiful as what it is like down here, we're still hearing sand dredging machines, we're hearing trains, we are hearing the traffic of 435, and birds, and the wind in the trees. And so it's just a beautiful spot, but it is just in the heart of a pretty industrial area, which makes it a really unique hike. So we've talked a little bit about some of the invasive pressure here on Nelson Island. And we know that to restore this place back and to take some of the pressure off of the native plants and begin to create a new understory of new shrubs, new baby trees, getting our grasses back, it's going to require at least a decade of work. And so we're going to have to forecast out some upfront costs, and so it'll be 3 years of really expensive hard management, removing the honeysuckle, removing the winter creeper, planting new trees, and then over time we'll have 3 years of a little bit less expensive and less labor intensive management, and then by the end of a decade we'd like this place to be a functioning, healthy island again, where we'll just visit occasionally to make sure the invasives are in control. So it's going to be a 10-year project to get this place in a condition that we'd like it to be in. Yeah, so just on the other side of the 435 bridge, the river is dammed up as a water intake for, I believe, Johnson County and Kansas City, Kansas. And so this water is quite still for the majority of the year. And it looks almost lake-like where we're standing. The flow is really slow. We just were able to purchase almost 60 acres of new land directly adjacent to Nelson Island. And so later in the video, we're going to show what that land currently looks like and talk about kind of some of the restoration ideas we have for that. And so we're going to put a large amount of buffer habitat on the edge of this property, and it gives us river frontage so people can explore the riverfront even further.
Okay, so one of the trees we talked about earlier is the sycamore, which is who we have here. We actually have several of them here because they take over this river edge. Some interesting notes about the sycamore and how to ID it is by the bark. So most trees, when they grow and they widen on their trunk, the bark will crack and stretch and fill in, but the sycamore's is really rigid, so it'll break off and create a mosaic of different colors due to different layers of the bark still being present. So when you look at an older sycamore, at the bottom it'll be dark gray, almost like a cool tone and rough, and as it goes up you get to a point where it is this like smooth white bark, like almost bone looking, and it looks like a painting to me, like the way the mosaic shows up, and it's always unique to the tree. So I love sycamores for that reason. And then another interesting note is it's a very important habitat tree for a lot of the small mammals and birds that live in this area, because the heartwood of the sycamore, as it grows, it'll rot out and create hollows inside of the tree that a lot of different animals will use as homes to overwinter in, to spend the night in the summer. So they are like essential to this ecosystem. So cool.
So this is a really exciting project. This is a piece of land adjacent to Nelson Island that JCPRD recently purchased, almost 60 acres of new public land. And so it's been a while that this has been kind of in the works, and we closed on the property last month, so this just recently became public land. It was a former tree farm, and it has a 10-foot fence all the way around it, and it's currently being managed in soybeans, and we'll keep it in agriculture until we're ready to build the park site. And so we're imagining maybe a 3/4 of a mile new paved trail extension on Mill Creek, possibly wetlands, wet prairie, which is a really rare habitat we don't have, and it's directly adjacent to the Kansas River. And so any more big river, prairie pothole type migratory bird habitat we can create, we're really excited about. Unfortunately, it's sandy, quick drying soil, so building wetlands is really complicated with drying. I think 2 inches an hour is how fast this percolates. And so we'll just have to see if it's going to be more swales and wet prairie than actual wetlands. And so we're pretty excited about the project and the acquisition, and we don't have to worry about the rest of our paved trail system collapsing into the Kansas River in Mill Creek, because we have all this new public land that gives us a buffer. We have a public art program. There's a master plan, and we have public art residencies, we have mural projects, we have permanent art that is added into our parks, we have temporary art, and we have it laid out over the course of years where and how that all gets built out with public input and committees and things like that. And so we're robustly engaging in public art, and a lot of it, since we manage parks, is about nature. And so most of our art has some sort of a natural theme to it. We are standing adjacent to a huge mural about the Mill Creek Streamway Trail. And so we're at Oaken Fieldhouse, and that's part of our sports complex off of Johnson Drive. And our public art program did a large mural to celebrate the Mill Creek Trail. And so this is a massive mural if you come and see it on the streamway. And we're talking, the grasshoppers are 20 feet long. You can see fire, you'll see the old mill, you'll see bluebirds, you'll see every aspect of nature on the trail on the side of this athletic sports building. And so you would never expect like to have this big dull side of a building, and now as the people use the trail and bike past, they're able to engage and see representation of all the natural things on the whole streamway corridor. And it's awesome that who would have thought that a public art program could bring so much life to the side of a sports complex. Thanks for joining us at Nelson Island today and exploring the Mill Creek Streamway corridor.
Now stick around for our live Q&A coming up next.
All right, how about that? Hey, Matt, good to see you again.
Glad to be here. I'm glad it's not windy like it was that day.
I know it was so windy that day. Yeah, it was pretty remarkable. I'm glad it all worked out though for us. So, okay, so we've got some really good questions in our Q&A. So folks, for those who are with us right now, if you have questions about natural resource management, questions about Nelson Island, questions about Johnson County parks in general, go ahead and drop your questions into the Q&A, and Matt and I will go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with a question from Carolyn asking about restoration on the island. She's asking what type of trees you'll be planting there when you do your restoration efforts.
Yeah, so I think what we're missing in the understory are a lot of the young hackberries and the young cottonwoods and sycamores, and we're missing the pawpaws. So I don't think we'll be planting any silver maple, but the honeysuckle has really extinguished all the seedling trees, and so there's very little recruitment. You kind of, if you hike it now, it's like a senior citizen center for trees, and so we need to have some more different age classifications of young trees coming up behind. And so as soon as we get the honeysuckle out, we'll probably be bringing a lot of the species you see on the island, just bringing in different age groups.
Very cool. And kind of on that same topic, Laura is asking, well, first I want to say Laura mentions that they're so happy to hear that Nelson Island will receive some focused resources for invasive removal. Do you have an idea of time frame? Also, you may mention later, but have the tree of heaven and Japanese hops been addressed? So kind of a double question there about invasive species. And
Yeah. So we're right now redoing our natural resource plan, and we have a huge list of cool projects in the county, and Nelson Island's going to be one of the projects on the wall. And so we're kind of figuring out what years to phase projects in right now. And so it could be as early as 2026, and it could be pushed back as late as 2028 or 29. So we haven't really given Nelson a cue yet in our next construction restoration window. So it's coming, but we just don't know quite yet what season it's going to start in. So people just have to wait on that a skosh longer. And then, yeah, when we go in to remove bush honeysuckle, we will 100% be removing tree of heaven. Japanese hops is a little more overwhelming because of how fast it grows, and we'll be addressing all the invasives on the island. But yeah, the rapid growth of the hops is it's pretty complicated to mess with. So yeah, we'll be hitting all of them. We just focused on bush honeysuckle in the video, but the whole island we'd be scouring for all the different plants that are causing problems.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense there. Okay, so a couple other questions in the similar vein. Val's asking if you're worried about younger trees, like you mentioned introducing younger trees. Is there concern about them being washed away from floods?
So I think I mentioned in the video, the Nelson Island is like adjacent to a pretty slow section of the Kansas River. And so the exterior north edge of the island hasn't seen a lot of sloughing off, or a lot of the upland parts of the island have been stable for a long time. The bigger change on the island is on the Mill Creek side. And if you saw in the drone footage, Mill Creek is going to push through the island, and we might end up with the Nelson Island 1 and 2. So just the power of water, it looks like it's going to push through, and we'll probably end up with a couple Nelson Islands. And if we don't have a bridge to the next one, we might be managing the invasives via canoe there.
I think that sounds like fun. A guided canoe or kayak trip, right?
Right.
Okay. So again, on the topic of invasive species, Patty is asking if you've noticed any invasive privet. She's curious if there's a standard for removing and control that is different from cutting and treating. She's seen that here in southern Leavenworth County, along with a lot of multiflora rose.
Yeah, so we don't see a ton of privet. It pops up every once in a while. It's kind of one of those emerging issues, and same with burning bush. We're beginning to see more privet and burning bush popping up in our woodlands, but they're no means to the same level of problem as some of our other species like bush honeysuckle and Sericea lespedeza. We honestly haven't. I can't think of the last privet plant we sprayed, other than if we came across a single one while we were out managing habitat. So it's one of those emerging invaders that we're always kind of watching for.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always interesting to look and see which species are kind of in the top range of severely problematic and those that are starting to creep in. And yeah, as our climate shifts, I'm sure we see more and more of these things changing. So
And I'd be foliar spraying it with glyphosate in the winter. Is probably like late fall is when I'd be going after it if I found it.
okay, thank you for that. That sounds great. Okay, so I'm going to pause our Q&A real quick so we can do our pop quiz. So for the first person who can answer this question correctly in the chat, who at the beginning of the webinar and at the end, which bird was singing? You could hear them as we were filming the Mill Creek area. So the first person to guess the bird correctly will win this set of note cards. And actually, Lisa Kripe, you were fast and furious. You got it. It is our kingfisher, which is very cool that we got to see a pair of them flying and calling back to each other. So, so Lisa, I will follow up with you via email to get your address so we can send this note card sent your way. All right. Okay, back to our Q&A. So folks, if you have questions for Matt, please put them in the Q&A so that we can see them. Okay. Matt, let's shift gears a little bit. Karen is asking what the best time of year is to burn to encourage forbs in the landscape. And I'm assuming Karen's talking about prairie type landscape.
Yeah, because in the video we were talking about the prairie, the grass we were visiting was burned in like hot April fires. So ideally, a dormant season fire or a late fall fire is what we're looking at. We have about 1,000 acres to burn this year, and we're trying to burn mostly from early November until, depending on how spring pops in the spring, probably till the middle of March. But a history of really hot April fire is how that prairie ended up really grass heavy. So yeah, if you want to encourage your wildflowers, fire in the winter, non-growing season is ideal. But a lot of time when you start burning in late March and early April, a lot of the forbs are already up, and you're going to burn them back pretty hard, and the grasses fill in pretty quickly.
And Matt, if folks don't have the option to burn, what other alternatives could they do to help increase forb diversity in their landscape?
Yeah, so just good disruption. So whether it's haying, mowing, anything you can do that removes some of that biomass, getting the thatch off the best you can. Um, but trying to find some method of action that disrupts the ecosystem and removes all that biomass, so the heavy thatch doesn't crowd out all the small seedlings.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the wildlife at Nelson Island real quick. Deborah is asking about avian bird flu. Do you have any insight on the status of that in our region currently? There's been a widespread bird flu affecting our songbirds, specifically at feeders. Do you have any insight to this, Matt?
I don't. My wildlife biologist that works for me is out of the office. I would have opened my door and yelled at him and told him to come in here, but he's out of the office with a new baby. So I really don't know too much about where the avian flu situation is.
Okay, well, we can find out and follow up in the show notes later and give you some insight. But one thing I do know, Deborah, and for those who enjoy feeding birds, which I know I do, is just make sure you clean your bird feeders regularly. Scrub them, use some diluted bleach, get them real clean. That way we're not spreading viruses or bacteria that could impact our wildlife. Okay, now we also want to know about bats. And you may not know this either, Matt, but are you familiar with bat populations on Nelson Island? Deborah mentions lots of big wooded trees for the bats to roost in.
Yeah, so it's actually an emerging thing that we're working on. I mentioned that we have a wildlife biologist, and I recently purchased bat acoustic equipment, and we are going to shortly know exactly what bats are on Nelson Island. And so we purchased some detectors through Wildlife Acoustics, and our staff are training up on understanding the echolocation signals and learning about what bats are there. And so we've been testing at our office. And we're able to see and kind of describe some bats this fall, but we'll be rolling that out and we'll be taking this kind of equipment to places like Nelson Island. We'll pull the SD card and he'll be able to analyze that and we'll be able to report back, what kind of rare and threatened bats we may have there. And so that's something that is emerging for us. And in 2025, we'll be doing a little bit of bat acoustic work.
Gosh, that's cool. I want to join in for
Right.
that. That sounds really fun. So Mike Miller is asking, do the public have an opportunity to observe prescribed burns on your parklands?
Yeah, so we don't generally publicize them because they're well, we don't invite the public because in our parks we can see 2 to 4 million visitors a year. And a lot of times when we're burning somewhere like Shawnee Mission Park, it draws traffic already. And as we're trying to operate equipment, we end up actually having to do road control and have to have our park police involved. We've really toyed with the idea of going somewhere fun like Lexington Lake and doing a night fire. And having people stay on the playground side of the lake and watch a fire burning on the other hill. And so it's not something we've recently done, but if we had the right conditions, we're open to inviting public out for like a public night fire. But generally, we don't know the weather forecast until 3 p.m. the day before on whether we're going to burn the next day. So getting that out in a good media way is pretty complicated when we're already trying to pull permits and assemble crews. And so generally, it's hard to get a notice out there that people would see in time.
Yeah, I get that. There's a lot of logistics to be handled for sure. But folks, if this opportunity does come up, we will be sure to let you know at Deep Roots if and when Johnson County Parks and Recreation District does maybe a nighttime fire or something like that. We'll keep you all posted for sure. Okay, so Glenda has a couple questions, asking about resources for pawpaw trees. Matt, do you have any specific resources you like to use for native trees and shrubs?
Generally, Kansas Forest Service is where I go for that information.
Mhm. That sounds
They've
good.
got they've got good online resources.
I'll be sure to include that in the show notes that I'll be sending to you all after today's program. And Glenda's second question is about redbud trees. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they ugly? Can you talk a little bit about redbuds in relation to the landscape at Nelson Island and just in general, Matt?
Yeah, so I think redbuds are an interesting species because, like, you can take Shawnee Mission Park, for example, with emerald ash borer, we lost a lot of the green ash in the park landscape and the woodlands. And one of the winners in that situation is redbud. And so it is a native plant to eastern North America, and it's not invasive. But if you walked one of our trails at Shawnee Mission right now, you'd be startled about how much of it there is. And but it's a pretty weak plant, and when we do prescribed fires, it's generally not going to be a winner. It's got a really thin bark, and any kind of fire is going to really set back redbud. And so we've got some prescribed fires planned in some areas that have some heavy redbud, and that generally knocks it back quite a bit. But yeah, when there's some open forest floor, redbud can really take off. So it's not a bad plant. It's a good host plant for all kinds of things, and it's good to have in a forest. But generally, some good management, we can keep it balanced and not just have an entire understory of redbud. But in some spots, you'll see that, and it does catch your attention.
Yeah. Okay, so on that same topic, Beverly is asking if you have any advice for an understory filling them with red buds, which it sounds like having good management practices. But they're also asking generally, they'd like to promote diversity. So do you have any recommendations on that? Even if especially if someone can't use fire in their landscape to manage that?
Yeah, I guess clearly you could, if you really cared about it that much, you could trim it back, or treat them, or if you really wanted to, you could spot spray them. But generally, it's not something we manage for.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't lose sleep over redbud.
Yeah, I would also recommend if someone has a bunch of red buds, plant some shady soft landings under them too. Add some diversity of herbaceous perennials, right? Get some flowers or forbs, some sedges in there too to help increase the diversity in that area. Also, red buds are just really cute. I love those pink blooms in the springtime. They're one of my favorite trees. Okay, so we have a few more questions and then we're gonna wrap it up here because we're getting close on time. But Val just asked if Nelson Island has an ephemeral plant population there.
Not that I'm aware of. I have not seen many ephemerals there. We try to monitor them around the county, and the Mill Creek Streamway Trail has ephemerals. So if you head south towards the Barker access, you'll see false ruin enemy and bloodroot and Dutchman's breeches. And so there are some really nice sections of forest further south that you're going to see ephemerals. They're not very prevalent on the island. I think it had a clearly with its history of a hermit living on the island, and there was some use in the past that I think there's been some disruption. But yeah, if you just walk the trail south towards the Barker access or towards Shawnee Mission Park, you're going to see a lot of ephemeral wildflowers on the Streamway corridor, maybe just not directly on the island.
Nice. Okay, Laura is asking if Japanese barberry invading anywhere, or sorry, do you see Japanese barberry invading anywhere in your county?
I have seen it occasionally, but not like I would call it an invasion.
Okay. That is good to know. Um, oh, I noticed we have a question from Hunter in the chat. He's asking, what are your favorite wet prairie species? Because you mentioned replanting that newly acquired area of land.
Yeah, so it's one of those neat habitats we always talk about planting, but we like never get around to it. And so I really like prairie cordgrass. So I like to see some of our wetter prairie grasses because we have so many of the other big crazy grasses. And occasionally you'll find a wet spot in one of our prairies that'll have prairie cordgrass. But it's one of my favorite grasses that we don't see a lot. So I'd love to get a big population of that going, maybe on that new parcel of land.
That's a cool grass. I also call that rip gut because it's
Yep,
pretty shitty.
yep. If
Walking
if
through
if
it.
you've worked out, all my seasonal employees very quickly know when they're walking through cordgrass.
Yep, you'll never forget it. Okay, and for our final question today from Meredith, and I'm sure many of others are wondering this too. Will there be volunteer opportunities in monitoring bats? Also, I would like to just ask, what are the opportunities for volunteering with Johnson County Parks in general?
Yeah, so our bat work is really early, and we are just kind of laying out the framework and maybe what that program is going to look like. And so I have a feeling there may be some opportunities down the road. Like next week, we're doing our thermal survey of deer in Shawnee Mission Park. So we're going to be out in the dark with our night vision thermal goggles, counting deer in the dark. And our bat work we're getting trained up on. So I'd expect in a couple years there may be a public opportunity with bats, but it's not something happening right now. Um, Volunteer wise, one of the best ways to get involved is through our partner Casey Wildlands, and so We have a lot of upcoming collection opportunities. We had one at Ernie Miller, I think, yesterday, Nature Park. And we have a lot of opportunities to probably remove some honeysuckle this winter. And so Casey Wildlands is our big volunteer partner that helps us teach people about natural resources and get out in the field and do that work on JCPRD parkland. And also becoming an extension master naturalist. They're a huge volunteer work group for us. So going through the extensions program, becoming a master naturalist, and that opens a big plethora of volunteering opportunities on parkland.
Very cool. And I do want to attest to how fun it is to do seed collecting with Casey Wildlands. I have a blast doing that, and it's just fun to get out into our natural areas and see what's in our own backyards. So, okay, well, thank you so much, Matt, for joining us today. We appreciate your expertise as always. So, folks, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to sign off here. I will send you information about the upcoming hike on Saturday, November 16th. I hope you'll join us to hike along Nelson Island. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your week and join us for our next episode on November 21st, our native plant webinar about autumn at the Discovery Center. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.